Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, the Hellblazer podcast. Today we are reading issue number 142, and just a little catch up on what happened in the last issue. Last issue was a one-shot called The Crib, and that was an interesting kind of really messed up story about a journalist who was a serial killer who thought someone was trying to find him, and this thing called The Crib, which was supposed to be the crib of the Antichrist fetus, I guess, and supposedly this fetus would take control of your body by way of his umbilical cord going into your skin and then pissing into your bloodstream. Needless to say, that all sounds pretty crazy, and in fact it was, because the crib was not a real thing, and when John found this reporter who was now a serial killer and thought the crib was talking to him and whatnot, he reached out and broke the illusion that this reporter had created because he believed in the crib so much. And it turned out the crib, which was actually like a wooden box that was supposedly latched to the writer's chest, turned out to be just a mini cereal box with a mouse inside that the writer had just taped to his chest, and I guess the mouse was like biting him. So like I said, crazy issue, kind of fun issue though. It's very interesting and different. And following that one, issue 142 is also interesting and different. It actually has two stories inside. So first things first, with issue 142, we got the cover. We see John is standing in what looks like a church or some kind of ancient building, and he's rubbing his left eye like maybe he's got a migraine or something is really taking a toll on him. And we see this issue is written by Warren Ellis with art on one story by Javier Pulido and the second story by James Romberger. And as we turn to the first page, we see the first story is called Setting Sun, and it starts off with John in Chaz's cab, and they are booking it. They're going as fast as possible. John looks very serious, like he's preparing for something very big. And the cab screeches to a halt in front of a building. And the second it stops, Chaz and John jump out, and John yells to Chaz, "Leg it! Come on, come on!" Then they both rush up some stairs to the front door, and Chaz has a crowbar in his hands, and John says, "Do the fucking door!" And as Chaz winds up the crowbar, he says, "Cover your face, mate." And just as he's about to bring the crowbar down, all of a sudden the front door opens, and this lady comes out and says, "What's all this then?" And John and Chaz are just stopped dead in their tracks, and they look kind of confused. And then all that running hits both John and Chaz all at once, and Chaz has to lean against the building and says, "Fuck's sake, John." And then John, who's resting his upper body on his knees, says, "Anna, phone call. You said trouble. Get here as soon as... Fuck, I can hardly breathe." And then Anna looks angry at John and says, "I said get round here on the hurry up. I had some trouble. I didn't say come mob-handed with big bits of fucking metal and all the bleeding publicity you can manage. Get indoors, you silly pair of bleeders. Starsky and fucking Hutch." And now that John has caught his breath, he stands up and he says, "What's the fucking trouble then? You were crying on the phone like a fucking 3-year-old with no dummy." And then she points at John and says, "Your kind of fucking trouble, John. Bought this house off Tony the Trousers 5 years ago. All the rooms rented out. I just took over the mortgage and the rent books. There was a bloke in here renting a room even before Tony the Trousers. Donkey's years he's been here. Died last night. One of the other tenants raised the alarm. I think the old bloke shat himself a bit violently. Ambulance men carted him out. That was that. Until the bastard turned back up in his bed an hour ago." And Chaz seems pretty shocked by this story, and he says, "Fuck." But John looks very stern, and he says, "Shut up, Chaz. Bloody hell. Come on, then. Let the dog see the rabbit. Chaz, go and make a cup of tea or something." And Chaz isn't very happy about that, and he says, "What am I, your bleeding mum?" But John and Anna ignore him, and they begin to go up the stairs to the man's room, and as Anna leads, she says, "It was horrible, John. It really fucking was. I had to tear me eyes away from it, or else I'd have ended up a bleeding Fraggle. I swear." Then they get to the top of the stairs, and she points at a door and says, "In there. I didn't even have a chance to clear his room out. All his stuff's still in there." Then John says to Anna, "Go on downstairs and have your tea. This will only take 2 ticks." Then Anna goes back down the stairs, and she's kind of hesitant as she looks back at John. and John holds the doorknob like he's also maybe a little hesitant. But he does go in, and the room is very bright, and it seems like the brightness is coming off the man's body, which is laying on a twin bed with nothing but a blanket covering his genitals. And other than that, there's just a bunch of papers and boxes around the room, maybe filled with diaries. And without John saying anything, the man on the bed talks and says, "My name is Yamagata. To whom do I have the pleasure of speaking?" And John answers, "John Constantine. Why have you come back?" And Yamagata answers, "I have a story to tell and a thing to be done." And this whole time, Yamagata has not moved his body at all. His head is just straight up and his eyes are closed like he is dead. So John walks over to his bedside and he pulls out his cigarettes and he says, "If I listen to the story and see that thing done, will that enable you to move on?" And they don't show it, but Yamagata must nod or something because he doesn't say anything. And then as John lights his cigarette, he says, "Tell me a story then." Then we see Yamagata's eyes open and he says, "I am Japanese. I am a doctor by profession. I had barely qualified before being inducted into the army in 1940. And with this, a flashback begins, and we see Yamagata driving in a Jeep in what looks like the countryside alongside of a couple other soldiers. And his narration continues. "Very soon, I was instilled in Chinese Manchuria, Manchukuo. It belonged to us. The people within it belonged to us. We were charged with the task of obtaining extreme methods of concluding the war in our favor. This naturally required extended experimentation to establish the limits of the human body's capability to absorb punishment. It was so cold the day I arrived." And just in case you don't know what this is referring to, this is actually based on a true thing that happened in China during World War II. When the Japanese invaded Manchuria, they set up their own concentration camps / death camps where they would experiment on the captured prisoners from China. And they did very, very, very horrible things, all of which were definitely on the same level of what the Nazis did to the Jews and other prisoners that they had. And I only say that because it's kind of a warning. What comes after what I just said is pretty graphic in the comic. And I didn't want you guys to think that this was like a made-up story. This actually happened. The things that are talked about being done to the prisoners really did happen. But Warren Ellis is just putting it through the context or the lens of this story in Hellblazer. So we see Yamagata arrive at the camp. And I'm not sure if there was a name for the camp, but I do know that the unit or the people stationed there were called Unit 731. So as the Jeep pulls up to the camp and the men and Yamagata get out, we see some other men bringing barrels out into an open area in the encampment. And this is like a 50-gallon drum, and they fill it with water, and then they put some wood under it and light a fire so that the water gets really, really hot. And Yamagata's narration continues saying, "The Jeep took me past an area designated as an outdoor frostbite experimentation station. My journey to the barracks was interrupted here. We watched the day's experiment. A woman had been tethered in the snow. Freezing water poured over her bare arms. It was at least minus 30 degrees Celsius that day. Soldiers broke up the ice trap while a vat of water was heated. That was our work in Manchuria, to find new ways to make people suffer." And underneath that narration, we get some very horrific panels of the men breaking up the ice around the woman's arms because, like the narration said, the soldiers have been pouring water on the woman's arms for a very long time in freezing weather. So they were basically frozen, covered with ice. So the soldiers broke that off. Then they moved the woman to the now boiling water in the 50-gallon drum, and they force her frostbitten arms into the boiling water, which makes all of the skin and muscle and tissue just kind of slough off of her arms, leaving just the bone. And keep in mind, this woman is still alive, and she's watching the tissue on her arms fall off. And I can only hope that the frostbite took care of any pain that she might have had, but probably not, because the whole point of this was to see how much pain they could make a person endure. And after this horrific scene, we cut back to John in the room, who looks pretty startled at that, and he just keeps smoking and doesn't say anything as Yamagata continues saying, "And so it went. Within a week, I'd collaborated in the construction of a rapid decompression room. And what he's talking about here is a room that is completely airtight that you could put a prisoner in and then create a very, very strong vacuum in. And then the soldiers would just see what happens to a human body that is alive when that happens. And we don't really see inside the room. We just see one of the doctors, I'm not sure if it's supposed to be Yamagata or just one of the other people, looking through the observation window, and his narration continues saying, "A father of two was tied down inside the room. He was ready to die. He'd seen his two daughters lost to him as recreational whores for the troops. There was something very much like relief on his face during the pressure drop. And then he prolapsed through his anus, his rectum, bowel, and large intestine blasting out and across the room like fireworks." And they don't show any images of that description. They did show the woman's skin falling off her arms in the panels. But we just get some blood splattering on the wall and that observation window under this narration. Then we cut back to the room where John is standing next to him, and John has his hands in his pockets now. He's still smoking. But Yamagata, who still hasn't really moved except opening his eyes, continues saying, "You're wondering how this would help us win the war. Would we build a great decompression chamber over the advancing barbarian armies and make their guts fall out of their backsides? You have to understand, we were insane." And then we get a panel that's a very close-up image of the observation window, and we see the doctor that was watching this decompression experiment is smiling very big and evilly, like he enjoyed watching that. Then we cut back to the flashback, and Yamagata continues to explain the experiments there, saying, "There was a boy as old as my brother at home in Osaka. I sank his hand in liquid nitrogen and demonstrated the results of a follow-up attack for applauding officers." And we see that. We see a young boy whose arm is tied to a stump, and like Yamagata said, it had been dipped in liquid nitrogen, so it was frozen, assumedly. And we see the young Dr. Yamagata take a large sledgehammer and smash up the boy's arm, shattering it into shards. And Yamagata continues, "Do you know how it is when you first fall in love with a beautiful girl? How you have to have her and have her. You cannot get enough of her kisses, her skin, her voice. You are crazed for her, hard for her always. The war was our woman." And as he says this last line, we get a panel of a small, malnourished child cowering in fear as he is being beset on by rats who are presumably about to eat him alive. Then we cut back to the room where John has still remained silent, and we see him lighting another cigarette, and he has a very conflicted look on his face. Like he doesn't know where this is going, and maybe he doesn't know what he's gotten himself into, because what is the ghost of this man going to ask him to do? And Yamagata continues saying, "On the day you dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, I had my hands deep in the life of a Chinese man whose name I never knew. Made unconscious with drugs, but still alive, somewhere deep inside him, close to my fingertips, he knew what I was doing. I was eviscerating him while he was still alive, just because I could." And under that narration, we get a panel of Dr. Yamagata reaching into the still alive Chinese man's body and removing his organs, and the assistants are putting the organs in jars, I guess to preserve. And his narration continues. "One by one, I removed his organs and threw them into glass jars moistened with brackish water. Pieces of leaf clinging to his kidney, mud on his lungs. As the bomb detonated over Japan, I held a beating live human heart cupped in my hands. These things and many more, all transcribed in my books. This is my story. Now there is only the thing to be done." Then we cut back to John in the room, and John says, "Absolution? So you can move on to wherever it is you're ending up? You're a disgusting old bastard, but the war was over a long time ago. What is it? Need someone to forgive you?" And Yamagata's ghost stares up at the ceiling and says, "No, I need someone to do it to me. I've been hiding in London for 50 years. writing down what I did for 50 years, masturbating over it for 50 years. I do not need to get over it to move on. I need it to be done to me to move on. That I couldn't experience it, being in love with a woman and unable to touch her. My instruments are under the bed still. Then we see John get on his knees and start looking under the bed, and he pulls out a box, and from that box he pulls out a scalpel, and he holds it in front of his face as if deciding whether he should do this or not. But then we see him bend down and move the scalpel towards Yamagata's ghost, and that is the end of the first story, so we can assume that John did as the man requested and remove his organs like Yamagata did to the Chinese man so many years ago. And good God, was that a heavy story. I mean, Hellblazer is heavy normally, or it can be at least, but because this one is actually based on real events, it is pretty hard-hitting. And this is actually a part of the war that I'm not sure gets that much, I guess, publicity or whatever. It's not talked about as much because it is overshadowed by what the Nazis did in their concentration camps. So I'm glad that Ellis did shine a light on this history and also didn't shy away from what actually happened. I mean, they literally show pretty much everything, or at least describe in words, exactly what happened to these Chinese prisoners of war. And I actually learned about this stuff from a movie called The Men Behind the Sun, which is kind of like, I guess you would call it the equivalent of, say, Schindler's List or something, but without the story of Oskar Schindler. So, I mean, it just really shows the atrocities that were done to the Chinese people by the Japanese army in World War II, specifically with Unit 731. So we'll leave that there, and like I said, this issue has two stories. So we move on to the second story, which is called One Last Love Song. We start off with John stumbling out of a pub in the wee hours of the morning, and the name of the pub is The Rat and Torch. And as he wobbles along the street, his narration says, 3 a.m, and Ronnie finally decides it's time to close the Rat and Torch before the police get really snotty. They should know better by now. Ronnie flouts the licensing laws at this time every year. The anniversary of his not getting his wedding tackle ripped off and dragged down to hell by his ex-wife, who was not what she seemed. Well, not what she seemed to Ronnie anyway. I always said she had horns and a tail. No bastard listens to me. Still, worth celebrating, Ronnie reckons. Can't say I blame him on the whole. Bit sick, drinking to the wife that exploded. But then, it wasn't my meat and 2 veg she was trying to roast on the flames of eternal damnation, was it? Then we see John pull out a cigarette as he leans against the light post for some balance. Then we see him struggle to light it, but eventually he does. And the narration continues saying, must be nice having an ex you don't miss. I miss 'em all, me. Even the ones who hated me. Even Mandy, who fucking loathed me. 1979. Shit of a year that it was. When England chucked away any hope of growing up and elected Thatcher on a platform of turning the country into a fucking cesspit. Then John walks past a park entrance, and as he does, he notices a girl leaning against the entrance and lighting a cigarette. And it looks like he kind of stops in his tracks, like he's not sure if he's seeing what he's seeing. And as he stares at her, his narration continues. Mandy, drama student, treated life as a big rehearsal for the stage, she did. Used to rake up her arms with her fingernails when she thought she did something wrong. She'd throw herself back on that dented bed that the landlady's husband died on the year before, in that awful bloody bedsit in Highbury, and say, take me, for Christ's sake. Not that I said no, but you know what I mean. So if you hadn't guessed, this girl he's seeing across the street is supposed to be Mandy. She is a young white girl who is wearing a short skirt and a large leather jacket, and she's got black lipstick on, and she kind of looks like a goth girl, but maybe more on the punk side. And as John gets to her, he tries to touch her face, but his hand just goes through her cheek, like as if she was a ghost. And John's narration continues. Lies in streaked mascara outside the university bar. 2 hours before the curtain goes up on the punk dress version of Dayton's death. One last peck on the cheek, and break a leg, love. Walk on. So after kind of reminiscing about Mandy, he walks past her through the park entrance, and he sees a woman sitting near a bush, and she is drawing on the ground. And as John sees her, his narration says, Emma. I was having Newcastle flashbacks when I met her. She'd take my hand and squeeze it, just a little, whenever I saw little curly blonde girls with blue eyes. And right there, he's referencing what Astra looked like, who was the girl that got killed accidentally in Newcastle by John. And his narration continues. She'd make little wounded sounds very quickly when she was on top, and I reached round behind her with my fingers. Always used to read the newspaper on the floor. Something with its head twisted round backwards chucked her out of an apartment block window in New York. And if you don't remember, we met Emma during Alan Moore's run of Swamp Thing, which is where John first appeared in DC Comics. So as John watches Emma in the park as she draws, she actually notices him, and she begins to draw, and she rips off something from her pad, and she holds it up to John. And I love this. It's a picture of John, and it just says bastard above it, but it's kind of like a caricature, and she's smiling as she gives it to him, so it's kind of like a joke. And as he stares at the drawing, his narration continues, saying, I think about her most days. I should let her die, the way the rest of the world did. But you can't help it, can you? One last wish. One last I love you could bring her back. One last missing you spell. Walk on. Then we see another woman running across the park, and she waves at John as she runs toward him, and he looks up at her, and unlike Emma, we don't know who this woman is. I don't believe we've seen her in the comics, but John recognizes her, and his narration says, Annabelle was a very healthy girl who nearly cracked me like a nut between her thighs in 1993. Lots of skiing and tennis and all that. Lived in a big old place in Surrey. Dad was such a standard issue mad colonel. I used to laugh to meet him. He even had those big portraits of old ancestors with the eyes cut out and hung on false walls so he could sneak around and look at you. She used to get on top of me and face the big painting of Grandma in her bedroom, coming like a flock of fucking banshees for Daddy's eyes. Always found an extra couple of £100 in me trench coat afterwards. Nod and a wink and a tap on the side of the veiny old nose. And I think this one's interesting because, well, obviously it's really messed up that her dad used to watch them have sex or whatever. But his relationship with this Annabelle girl supposedly happened in 1993. So that means this was all happening kind of off page during the Garth Ennis run. So of course I had to look into that because that doesn't make sense because Kit was a thing by then. So in 1993, that just happened to be the year that Kit and him broke up. So this must have happened, I guess, after he was homeless and he had been broken up with Kit. Just wanted to make sure the timeline fit for you guys. So as John thinks about Annabelle as she runs past him, he looks kind of sad, and his narration continues, saying, A few months after we split up, some drunken twat slammed his Volvo into the side of her MG and cut her in half. Bottom half in the driver's seat, top half in the passenger seat. Walking on, walk on. And it looks in the panel like he's trying to pick up his pace. It's either that or he's stumbling, but it looks like he's trying to run. Then he sees another woman standing by a tree, and she is all in black. She has long black gloves, and she's got like this kind of black hair that's in a swoop across her face. And she's smoking a cigarette, and as John sees her, his narration says, Keeley, Miss Drugstore, 1988. Ate half of London alive. Shagged out by 90. Diagnosed HIV positive in 91. Married some coke fiend Aristo in 92. Currently owns half of Bloody Hampshire. Married into the right circle. She always had some luck. Her husband hasn't aged a day since 1890. There's about 100 other people like him in London. Keeley hasn't aged a day since 92. Hasn't got AIDS anymore either. I know her husband, but she doesn't know that. Story for another day. We always got on pretty well, me and Keeley. I don't think he'll do to me what he said he wanted to do. Besides, I'd fuck up his shirt sleeve something chronic. So out of all the women in this issue that John is kind of reminiscing about as he sees their ghosts in the park, this one I was confused about because it sounds from the narration that she's still alive, but in one of the panels as John walks past her and she stares at him smoking, there's a bunch of ravens or crows, and they are swarming around her, and they are flying through her body, so she's definitely a ghost or apparition of some kind. And I should say also that as John walks through the park, the deeper he gets in and passes these women and keeps walking, it seems that they turn into balls of light or orbs, and follow John, because in the art he has 4 orbs now following him. Then he comes around a bend on the park path, and he sees someone we definitely know from the Warren Ellis run. He sees Isabel running in the park, playing with her bubble wand. And as John sees her, his narration says, "One last love song, to bring you back, to bring you back. One last shot in the dark, one last kiss in the black. Walk right on." So she doesn't seem to acknowledge him, but as he goes through her bubbles that are floating through the air, he does his own little dance, kind of mimicking the way she was dancing around. And he has a smile on his face, kind of like he's remembering something good because he did save her soul already. Then we turn the page and we see John toss his cigarette on the ground and stamp it out and light another one. And as he does that, his narration says, "And keep walking for as long as you can. It all ends, old son. In the death, all you've got is a memory and an old love song. 1987. Rained all fucking summer. Happy when it rains. Jesus and Mary Chain." And right there, he's referencing a song and the group that played it. And his narration continues. "Mary, her name was, had a right hook that'd make Muhammad Ali shit himself. And someone else that autumn." And as he thinks that, we see a woman come out of nowhere and walk right next to him. And it looks like she's going to bump into him, but she actually goes through him and then continues to walk past. And as John watches her walk away, he holds out his hand and his narration says, "Tess, basement club in Soho. Danced for hours. When we opened the door for a breath of fresh air, a huge plume of steam came out with us, lit amber by the streetlights as it climbed." And now it seems that John has come to the end of the park pathway, and the exit arch is just in front of him. And as he watches Tess walk towards it, John must get a feeling because his narration says, "The gang's all here, and I can hear music. And I'm almost afraid to turn around." And as John looks behind him, and he sees the ghosts of all the women that have died from past relationships he's had, some of which are the women we've seen already in this story, but some are ones that we have not. And as John turns and looks behind him, he says, "Oh, Christ." But the ghosts don't really acknowledge him. They just walk through him towards the archway, which has begun to glow and has a very bright white light in the center of it now. And as the women walk towards it, they begin to float up into that light. And John holds out a hand to them as if to longingly say goodbye. And as he does this, his narration says, "One last love song, to bring me back. And then walk on. Keep walking on." And then he takes a puff of his cigarette, and then it looks like he turns around and walks back down towards the pathway he came. And that, my friends, is the end of the second story and the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comic books, all one word, @gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.